Welcome to the Medicine and Science podcast from the BMJ. I'm Cameron Abbasi, Editor-in-Chief. In today's episode, rethinking how we measure the harm caused by the arms industry.
And often those people will be put forward as spokespeople. So they'll appear regularly in the media talking about the sorts of benefits of investing in more arms.
We'll look at the lifelong and multigenerational impact of starvation with a particular focus on Gaza.
Lack of nutrition alters the switches on the genome, increasing stress sensitivity and thereby increasing individuals' responsiveness to stress, and that increases their risk of cardiovascular disease.
And we finish by asking, what is the appropriate focus on prevention in general practice?
This tsunami of preventive medicine, it causes real suffering for real patients. The patients that are exposed, but also the opportunity cost, the patients that do not get access to care that they need.
Firstly, I'm joined in the studio by our international editor, Jocalyn Clark, to talk about a new series the BMJ is publishing over the next few weeks about the arms industry as a commercial determinant of health. So, Jocalyn, welcome. Tell us about the series.
The series is fantastic. There's been lots of study and publications, including in the BMJ, looking at other industries like tobacco, alcohol, fossil fuels. But it seemed to me that we hadn't done enough to examine the arms industry and the way that it impacts on health. And so we have two terrific analysis articles and two editorials.
Okay, first of all, why now?
Why now? Well, of course, conflicts around the world are increasing. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are more conflicts in the world now than ever since the Second World War. And because the arms industry, the arms market, is growing massively and globalizing, not least because many countries around the world are expanding their defense and military spending. That's making arms sellers very buoyant, and we expect governments to be spending a lot more money arming themselves in light of what's seen as growing global aggressions.
Okay, and we're recording this week on the 3rd of September today. There is an arms fair in London, is that correct?
Yes, the world's largest arms fair, which is called Defence Security and Equipment International, takes place in London every 2 years at the Excel Centre, and it will open on Tuesday, September 9th.
Okay.
There's been lots of community resistance to this. Many campaigners have protested against the arms fair, and as I understand it, they've driven arms fairs out of other major cities in the UK. But this one will be held next week, backed by the UK government. There'll be 55,000 delegates. It seemed to us very good timing to publish a piece of work that calls for more scrutiny of the arms industry and its health harms.
It's a conference, it's a fair convention that's promoting death, essentially.
Yes.
Selling death. Is that why we want to call it a commercial determinant of health? I mean, you and I have written an editorial about this, but perhaps for anybody listening, could you explain what is a commercial determinant of health and why the arms industry should be one?
Yeah, commercial determinants of health are those things associated with the behavior and practices of a corporation, of an industry, that impact on health. So here it's shining a light on the practices of the industry, not just the products that it develops, manufactures, and sells. And in this case, the arms industry has a set of practices, as I've said, have been largely unscrutinized, but they have major impacts on both health, but also our discourses around what security is, how security and defense might be prioritized over health. And those practices include lobbying, marketing, manipulating media, shaping narratives about threats, and other things that actually we've seen well documented and confronted or challenged by industries like big tobacco or big alcohol. But now we're shining a light with the authors who have written these two great papers for the BMJ, asking that we examine how the arms industry takes from that corporate playbook, how they've managed to develop very close relationships with governments and militaries in ways that extend their already mind-boggling profits.
Yeah.
And it's asking us to examine that using a different lens, saying what's the trade-off here?
Yeah.
Profit at the expense of health, conflict, as you say, at the expense of peace.
It's just taken for granted that we do need to acquire more arms. We need to equip ourselves better. And of course, that any commercial entity, in the arms industry is a commercial entity, sees that as a way of making profits. And you don't really see, as you're seeing, any analysis of whether that's disproportionate or not.
The ways that it's been normalized in our culture is something I think that is really illuminating in these papers. And then the authors go on to describe, the range of tactics that the arms industry uses in order to grow its business and profit, normalize itself and its importance within our cultures. And then it also sets out a number of ways that we can, ask tougher questions.
Yeah. So it's quite a complex area, but I think it's interesting you bring up the point about the tactics, because what we tend to see with the commercial determinants of health, whatever the industry, is that the playbook or the tactics tend to be very similar.
Yeah, indeed. And that's what's so fascinating in a way. It begs the question of why haven't we looked at this industry more closely in the past, particularly since it's so powerful and it kind of it sort of sits behind this veil of national security. I mean, one point I think we might want to sort of emphasize is something that you and I raise in our editorial to introduce the series, which is, no one's saying that we should leave our countries defenseless. But it is about the proportionality, as you say, and it is about just sort of counterbalancing the power that is flowing to these companies, but also the potentially unhealthy relationship with government that the authors signal. I mean, there are some very substantial conflicts of interest here that we have worked really hard over the last couple of decades to ensure don't happen when it comes to other industries, but we are kind of letting go with the arms industry.
I mean, one of the issues which I think is very important is the fact that we understand that geopolitics is very complicated at the moment. I think we fully understand the call to say, well, let's make sure that, if you're in Europe, for example, that you're adequately defended, that your armies are adequately funded, and that you have the infrastructure and the technology, and also, of course, the armaments that you need you're facing potentially, a threat from Russia. I understand that situation. The question really is, the situation we're moving to is that, do we need to move that far? And we're just accepting very easily that we need to move from, say, 2% to 5%. And then secondly, that we need to do, and I think this is the key bit, that we need to do it at the expense of welfare. And we make some pretty strong points about warfare versus welfare and the benefits of the peace dividend, because peace does bring benefits, and there is lots of evidence around that. Might you just explain that a little bit?
What you and I raise in our editorial, I think, is to sort of put this in perspective for readers, which is this is bringing to the fore again those warfare versus welfare debates that we haven't really seen since, as I'm told, since the end of the Cold War period, when lots of governments around the world defunded their militaries in favor of investing in health and education, which do bring great benefits to the well-being of populations and societies. So we need to, and I hope that we have the opportunity to really emphasize and resurface those debates, because that's effectively what this is. That we are seeing increased defense and military spending, which is being accepted fairly easily by many people at the expense of health and education spending. And that is obviously going to have major ramifications that are not positive, and that will have long-term impacts. And those are the questions that we want to raise. And the peace dividend is one way of thinking about that. It's sort of an old concept that asks for commitments from governments, nationally and globally, to maintain health and education spending whilst they are investing in defense. And what you and I call for is renewed support to a global peace dividend campaign that had been established in 2021 by a number of science and health leaders. And we'd really like other medical journals and all health professionals to join us in supporting that.
Good. Jocalyn, thank you very much. Now, you interviewed Mark Bellis from Liverpool John Moores University, who's one of the lead authors of the first two articles, the analysis articles in this series. Let's hear what Mark thinks about this and why he thinks it's time we take the impact of the arms industry on health much more seriously.
We're talking about a pot across the military globally of $2.7 trillion a year, and the top 100 arms companies taking in revenue of over 600 billion. So that's a lot of impetus, a lot of stimulus, if you like, for them to go out looking for the money. What we have to do is challenge that and make sure we go out and fight for health in that same context.
I really think that readers will appreciate that guns, weapons, and other arms have direct health impacts, particularly nowadays when conflict and wars are all around us. But they're going to be, I think, less familiar with the ways that the corporate practices of the industry itself are as important. So what are some of those practices?
Well, what we want is an environment that does protect people, that does protect health, has a humanitarian context. And that means that we need to get the regulations right, the laws that govern countries, the international treaties, how we assess and control the environmental pollution and contamination effects of arms and arms development. We also need to make sure that not too much money is taken away from all the other things we need to look after people, to provide healthy, safe countries. And we need to make sure that the knowledge about weapons and their consequences is out there. So we need to protect those things. But the industry may have a variety of ways that it tries to influence those. So it might do something called regulatory capture. So that's things like lobbying, people going out there spending millions of pounds to try and convince senior people in political positions and other public positions of authority to make decisions which benefit the industry, which pushes more money in their direction. They may attract people who have either been in positions of power in government or in the military, so that once they leave those positions, they start to come across and work for them. They know how to influence those systems. They know how to make the system work for them. And often those people will be put forward as spokespeople. So they'll appear regularly in the media talking about the sorts of benefits of investing in more arms, talking up the threats from certain situations, all of which stokes investment, just as we can see now that's happening internationally in the arms industry, and puts money into their pockets.
That full interview will be on our YouTube page, and the first articles from the series are currently free to read on bmj.com. The blockade on food reaching Gaza remains in place, risking further starvation. Elizabeth Mahase, clinical reporter for the BMJ, finds out about the acute, chronic and generational impact on the Palestinian population.
I don't think politicians really recognise to any degree at all the long-term damage that is inflicted by famine and famine under a state of stress. So I think it doesn't get taken into account, and therefore the responses tend to be weak. There's not an urgency. I think as scientists, we see the images that you've been talking about, and we can understand what this means for the future as well as what's happening now. But I'm not sure the politicians actually have a real understanding of the health costs that have been buried in bodies that are going to come back to the surface and adversely impact health across the life course into the next generation. And it's not just health, it's human capital, it's cognitive function, it's the capacity to succeed in education. It's so many different aspects of just being human that are being damaged in this setting.
I'm really very, very concerned. Even if the famine in Gaza would stop today, it still has long-term consequences. Still, the youngest generation will have consequences in terms of their physical and mental health and their behavior for the rest of their lives.
That was Jonathan Wells, Professor of Anthropology and Paediatric Nutrition at the University College London, and Tessa Roseboom, Professor of Early Development and Health at the University of Amsterdam. In August, famine was officially declared in Gaza after months of aid being blocked from entering the Strip by Israel. At least 370 people, including 133 children, have so far died from acute hunger, and there appears to be no end in sight. The consequences of the Israeli-induced famine in Gaza are profound, and we have very clear evidence on the impact of starvation on an individual's development. Starvation has happened in a number of settings in the past. Leningrad and Netherlands during the Second World War are notable examples. Scientists have studied the people who suffered during these famines and have tracked the impact across generations.
So in the short term, malnutrition immediately leads to increased risk of mortality through a number of different pathways. Humans, like any organism, expect to get a certain amount of nutrition, and they divide it across different functions. And we normally think of those functions very broadly as maintaining health, growing, reproduction in adults, and defending against threats. And the first thing that happens with malnutrition is that we don't have enough energy for all of those functions. And the one that's prioritized is simply survival, defense. But the problem is that defense comes at a cost to health. So infants have high requirements for protein as well as energy, and they are going through in normal development of the process of continuing to construct the vital organs, the heart, the liver, the kidney, the pancreas, and so on, as well as muscle tissue. And if we have deficits to nutrition in that period, even if we give better nutrition later on, we can't recover what was missed during those critical periods. We call them critical windows. It's a process of rapid cell division. And that cell division is helping, if you like, build the architecture of organs like the heart and the lungs and the pancreas and so on. And if we miss that window, we can't really recover the full benefits later on.
The facts about what malnutrition does to the human body are harsh. The reality is there just isn't enough food being allowed into Gaza, and as a result, children are suffering. Chris McIntosh is the Humanitarian Response Advisor for the charity Oxfam. Here he is explaining the nutritional logistics of what's needed.
Aid and food needs to be allowed to enter unfettered at the rates that we saw pre-blockade. So that's upwards of 600 trucks, more or less, every day. And Gaza's not seeing not even half of that. The problem is that it's not enough in quantity, and it's not enough in nutritional value. And what should happen is there should be medical grade nutrition that's introduced into their diet to get them healthy enough that they can start having other food. So indeed, right now the market is flooded with all sorts of starches and carbohydrates. So you have pasta, you have rice, you have bread everywhere you want it almost. But that's not nutritional, and that's not going to bring someone back, especially not a child, from acute malnutrition. So it's these details that really matter. It's that nuance, and it's far more complicated than yes, some items are getting into Gaza.
And it's not only about getting nutritious food into Gaza. The population has to be well fed enough to be able to access that food. Marie McGrath is the former head of the Emergency Nutrition Network. She has a huge amount of experience in this area. Here she is explaining.
When we think of food aid, and there's been a lot of talk of food aid and food drops, etc., that's the tip of the iceberg. When you see a very thin child and you concentrate on the weight, and you see the weight and they must gain weight, and it's such a crude indicator of malnutrition. Beneath that surface, there's going to be micronutrient deficiencies, metabolic changes, etc. And so as people talk about getting access to food, it is access to so much more than that. And it's overwhelming, the thought of what is needed for those who are looking to gain access. I think this is no news to those who are on the front line and responding, but it really needs to be an awareness amongst the funders and the responders who are supporting that response, that the level of intervention and resource and capacity and the devastation that will be faced once there is access. Food drops ain't going to be doing it. So trucks are all necessary. They're not going to be cutting it. I think in my 25 years in working in humanitarian response, I think this is probably the most extreme that I'm afraid to say, witnessed.
We know how starvation in childhood can affect you throughout your whole life, but these effects will also be evident in the Palestinian people for generations. Tessa Roseboom has studied the impact that a period of famine in the Netherlands, caused by the Nazi regime's withholding of food during the Second World War, has had on subsequent generations.
Our lives don't start at fertilization, but the egg that made me was actually made when my mother was in my grandmother's womb, just like for everyone else. And for me, that happens to be exactly during the Dutch famine. So my grandmother was pregnant with my mum when the famine started, and that must have been around the time that in her ovaries the eggs were formed. And we know that also for the Dutch famine, that those exposed to famine prenatally were epigenetically altered by the lack of food. Lack of nutrition alters the switches on the genome, which switch on, for instance, genes that code for stress receptors, increasing stress sensitivity, and thereby increasing individuals' responsiveness to stress, exactly as we've seen in babies who were conceived during the famine in a very stressful time, them responding to stressors in a much exaggerated way than people who had not been exposed to famine. So with lots of daily life stressors, their blood pressures rise much more extremely, and that increases their risk of cardiovascular disease, which is also what we found in the Dutch famine. Men and women exposed to famine prenatally have more cardiovascular disease and actually increased cardiovascular mortality.
It's clear that the effects of malnutrition and starvation will persist in Gaza for decades. Fast and sustained nutritional aid is needed urgently. Chris McIntosh from Oxfam gives us the final account, for now, of this man-made catastrophe.
Some months ago, it was mainly in a wait and see. We were in a wait and see mode, trying to identify where this is going, how many supplies in reserve we had, and that other people had, in order to pull through, hoping that the blockade would be lifted. And now that bubble has burst, so to speak. There are no reserve stocks anymore. There's whatever people can find in the market. And obviously the big difference is people are acutely malnourished. People are starving. Whereas before we still were managing somewhat. But now it's gotten to endemic levels. There's nobody that's not affected by what's happening on the ground in Gaza.
You'll be able to see the full video interview with all four speakers on the BMJ's YouTube channel shortly. To read our ongoing coverage of the crisis in Gaza, please visit bmj.com.
Finally, one of our editors, Helen MacDonald, was at the Preventing Overdiagnosis conference in Oxford this week. Helen talked to the authors of a BMJ paper that's been well read this year about why they think preventative care has destabilised the work of general practitioners.
So I'm Minna Johansson. I work as a GP in a small town on the Swedish west coast, and I am a researcher focused on sustainability of healthcare.
My name's Steve Martin. I'm a general practitioner at Berry Family Health Center in rural Massachusetts and a professor at UMass Chan Medical School.
I'm Iona Heath. I used to be a general practitioner in London, but I'm long time clinically retired, but I still do a bit of thinking, writing and speaking.
And we're going to talk today a bit about a piece that you wrote early in 2025. It was published in the BMJ and it's called Sacrificing Patient Care for Prevention, Distortion of the Role of General Practice. How did you three, quite disparate people at different stages of your careers, come to write this piece?
I had the good fortune actually to read one of our co-authors' publications from 2017, Tina Koronic from the University of Alberta. And she and James McCormick and others wrote a paper called Competing Demands in Primary Care. And I thought it was an extraordinary insight for me that they shared, which was that these are competing demands, and that when you have any scarce resource, as virtually anything human is, you're trading one thing for another. And what they pointed out so thoughtfully was when you're doing more prevention, you're doing less care for people who need help.
So simply speaking, how do you differentiate prevention in primary care from other activities that primary care might do?
I think that the primary responsibility of any doctor is to respond to the patient's agenda. And the patient's agenda, what they've come for, what they're frightened about, what they're worried about, has been increasingly pushed aside by what we're mandated to do by health policy.
Can you give an example?
I had this experience with a GP trainee that I'm mentoring, and he had a patient with diabetes, and he was doing the control, and the lipid levels was a bit too high, and some of the measures weren't optimal. And then the patient started talking about suicidal thoughts, and the whole conversation ended up being that. So when he came to me and asked about advice on how to handle the patient, he was so frustrated because he had spent the whole consultation on the suicidal thoughts and not the lipid not the cholesterol level. And it's like, how can we have a system where GPs feel frustrated when they have actually listened to what's most important to the patient? That's something really cruel in medicine, I think.
Has it always been that way?
It has not, no. Although this tension has existed for many thousands of years. And so, but in the recorded history of healing professions, 5,000 years or so, it's truly been only the last 50 or so that we've had these risk factors and epidemiological studies that allow us to sort of tease apart what could be considered risks or confer risks. So often historians talk about what's called the longue durée, sort of the long arc of history, but this is a very short arc. This is a 50-year arc where medicine has changed dramatically in the outpatient setting.
And what's the key? It's the computers coming into the consulting room.
The computer coming into the consulting room and prompting us and showing a GFR that's 1 point off and showing up red now and capturing. It is an attention capturing device.
And a surveilling device.
In surveilling, while I'm being surveilled as a GP, my metrics are whether the last blood pressure was, quote, controlled, last blood sugar was controlled, whether someone had their annual physical, none of which have to do with whether a woman who is suffering is feeling better.
So there's a philosophical point, but also within your piece, I heard that there's a feasibility point.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what has happened, as you alluded to, Stephen, is this exponential expansion of preventive medicine. We have gone from focusing on the really high-risk population, which is quite a small proportion of the population, to include the majority of the general population with very low risk. One study from Norway showed that applying the CVD guidelines to the general Norwegian population defines over 80% of the population as in need to see their GP to reduce their cardiovascular disease risk. And it would take more GPs than are available in Norway to only follow the guidelines on hypertension. So if we would do preventive medicine as is required from us in guidelines, we would have to stop all other care. We couldn't see any patients for any acute symptoms or chronic conditions. And obviously no one wants that, because it would make care hugely ineffective and unequal. And no one wants inefficient and unequal care. It's just that you don't understand the consequences of making these absurd recommendations in preventive care.
So it's not just a moral principle that you're working from here. There's an element of pragmatism about the resources. But even if those resources were available, you make some points that question whether these interventions are effective.
Well, exactly. And are they they feel like a cop-out or a fig leaf for government and policymakers who know very well that if they did something about financial equity and, equitable opportunities in life, they would do much more for the health of the general population than pursuing people for their blood pressure or their smoking. Some very rich people survive into old age still smoking and still drinking because their socioeconomic status is very favourable. I used to say when patients would come for screening, all you need to do is to be rich and to be happy.
Don't be poor.
Truly. No, we say the same in the US. We say, look at your zip code and it'll tell you your health.
Yeah. And that's very interesting that how you begin to make that case. And I know, Minna, you've been doing some other work when we're thinking, okay, well, if we wanted to achieve the same effect of not having people with very high blood pressure or not having people with a number of these diseases, what are the alternatives? Tell us a bit about some of the work you're doing there.
Yeah, so it's some work that is really in the beginning, but we call it vertical reviews. And the idea is to give policymakers transparent information about the trade-offs between benefit, harms, costs, and burdens, both to individual, to professionals and the systems, comparing interventions targeting individuals within healthcare to interventions targeting structures, targeting populations and structural interventions.
So if we took the example of smoking, you could have a conversation with a patient as a healthcare professional to say, I think it would be a great idea if you stopped smoking. What would the alternatives be?
For example, taxes on tobacco or smoke-free public policies about smoke-free public spaces, which has been the major cause of the massive drop in smoking in many countries. So the individual advice have had a very limited effect, but we have been very successful with other structural measures. And I think it's also important to point out that when preventive medicine expands, it takes resources not only from within the healthcare system, but also from the community and the society. So every pound or euro we spend on healthcare could be spent on schools, the judiciary system, or bicycle paths, or stuff that increases equity and flourishing in the community, which has often a much greater impact on health and well-being. So if we want to prevent cardiovascular disease for 80% of the population, then we should zoom out and wonder, is it really credible to believe that an individualized strategy, one person at a time within healthcare, is the most effective and feasible approach?
Well, that zoom out is ultimately, I think, very interesting. But your paper feels very grounded and zoomed in what's happening to those clinicians in the consulting room. And I know another theme of this piece is that there's harm coming to the doctors actually in the system itself. Tell us a bit about that theme.
Well, I think that medical education, of course, I may be out of touch, but I think medical education is still focused on the care of the sick. So these young doctors come out, they're very well versed in how they should be setting about helping the sick. And then they find themselves being judged on a whole raft of metrics that absolutely ignore the concerns of the sick and are to do with meeting targets for all sorts of ridiculously aberrant numbers, only a very small minority of which are really relevant to their long-term health. And they're completely disorientated. They feel they're failing their patients. They feel they don't know what to do. They have much less access to experienced colleagues than we used to have. And so they are lost. They feel betrayed. They feel let down. A lot of them leave. And it's a tragedy.
This is an incredibly eloquent piece, and it contains so many things that I think both patients and doctors can really relate to. What is it that would be the dream impact that this piece would have? Who would you like to read it, and what would you like them to do?
I would be grateful if people who have any interaction with healthcare for their friends or family members, loved ones, would read in the paper and help them understand why they're not able to get the care that they're seeking. And that our attention is being pulled away from the real needs and hopes of our members of the community.
And also policymakers, right? When I'm thinking about this, I feel so frustrated about this tsunami of recommendations of preventive medicine with no responsibility taken on any level for the consequences. This tsunami of preventive medicine, it causes real suffering for real patients. The patients that are exposed, but also the opportunity cost, the patients that do not get access to care that they need. And I think that kind of communication, like if this paper could be used to communicate that to the people who actually make the decisions, who has the power to change this for a better healthcare system, for a better community. I think that would be my dream.
And I'm going to agree with that. I would like Wes Streeting, our Minister of Health, to read it, and Ministers of Health across the world, because they are facing a ridiculous problem of exploding healthcare costs, static or worsening health statistics. It is absolutely feasible for a centrally funded healthcare system to care adequately for everybody who is sick. What is not ever going to be feasible is pursuing all the multitude and increasing number of risk factors for possible illness in the future. And I feel absolutely certain that history will condemn us. They will look back at this as a complete nonsense of pushing the sick aside and trying to stop people becoming sick when that very process makes them sick.
That's it for this episode. We'll be back in a fortnight with more medicine and science. Until then, I'm Cameron Abbasi. Thanks for listening.